The first night I heard it, the city had already swallowed itself into silence. That particular kind of silence that isn't empty at all, but crowded with small, anxious sounds. The tick of a cooling pipe, the tired whir of the refrigerator, the distant brake squeal of a bus that would not come down my street at this hour. My window framed the building across the narrow alley, where a strip of moonlight ran down the brick like a blade washed and left to dry. Somewhere above me the elevator coughed and then slept again, and in the corridor outside my door the soft, irregular scrape began. At first it was no more than a murmur of friction, the hush of something dragging across cheap carpet. A pause, a breath, a second scrape. The red digits on my stove clock had just turned to 3:11 a.m., numbers that looked like a wound. I was awake because the new neighbors had moved in that day, and the building was always a little louder when it absorbed fresh lives. Doors banged. Laughter echoed. Boxes thumped. But midnight had passed. The hallway lights dimmed to their nightly yellow bruise, and whoever lived across from me had finally fallen quiet. Until that scrape began again, uncoiling with a patience that felt intentional. I stood in the dark for a long moment, listening, letting my eyes adjust. The sound came in careful increments, as if the thing, whatever it was, had weight that demanded negotiation. Then there was a faint clink, like metal touched to metal and then pulled away, polite and secretive. I stepped toward the door, and the floorboards answered with a familiar complaint, an old man clearing his throat. On the other side, in the corridor, the motion stopped, as if it had heard me too. I froze. The refrigerator hiccuped. Something far below a boiler exhaled tired heat into the skeleton of the building. And then, as though reassured I wouldn't open the door, the dragging resumed. I pressed my eye to the peephole, that little glass fisheye that always made the world look damp and swollen. The corridor tilted in soft distortion, the exit sign at the far end glowing a sickly red, the popcorn ceiling stippled like diseased skin, the welcome mats outside each unit sagging with shoe prints and dust. The new neighbor's door, apartment 4C, stood ajar, dark as a mouth. I could see only a slice of their threshold, a smear of shadow. The corner of a box collapsed and folded against the wall. The dragging sound had texture now, a grain in it, a faint whisper of fibers surrendering as if heavy canvas was being pulled along the carpet. Every few feet, the thing caught on the threshold ridges, snagged, and then the shadows bent with the effort of lifting and resettling. A shape passed through the fisheye field, tall, narrow, carrying something long and wrapped, the length of it bumping softly against the wall as it moved. The hallway light hummed louder, and for a moment the bulb flickered, a moth trapped inside glass, and the shadows stuttered with it, breaking apart and reforming. The person was barefoot. I could see the pale scallops of their toes as they arced and pressed, leaving faint half-moons in the dusty corridor. Bare feet at this hour, bare feet and something elongated, tucked in linen or plastic or a tarp that swallowed the sound of bones if bones could speak. The shape vanished into 4C's open mouth. Silence tried to reassert itself, but it had lost credibility. Then a second shape appeared, shorter, heavier, shoulders rounding forward with the weight. It dragged another parcel, similar in length but thicker in the middle, which made the wrapping bulge like a swallowed breath. This one did not lift at the thresholds. It forced the parcel forward with a slow shove, inch by inch. There was a sound like the held-in groan of a piano being moved by hands that regretted their strength. A thin smell rode the air now, sneaking under my door. Bleach, sharp and clean in a way that seemed obscene at 3 a.m. I should have moved back from the peephole, should have put a polite wall between myself and the scene. Instead, I leaned closer, the glass cooling the oil of my skin. Movement flickered at the periphery. A third presence, smaller, a jittering motion halfway between walking and crawling. It hugged the baseboard as it passed, and the corridor's nightlight caught on something reflective at its wrists. A quick flash that might have been a bracelet, might have been tape. It wasn't carrying anything. It hurried ahead of the others and slipped inside the apartment like a child darting behind a parent's legs. A whisper followed, the hush of a voice pitched to soothe or to command. I couldn't tell which. It had no words, only shape. It stroked the air thin, and the air thinned obediently. The taller figure re-emerged without the long bundle, shoulders relieved and strange in the pallor of the light. I saw a hand reach for the doorframe, touch it briefly, as if counting heartbeats through wood. Then came a new sound, bird-like at first and then lower, as if the building's throat couldn't decide between song and warning. A whistle, perhaps, but not passed through lips. It seemed to bleed out from the very paint, a resonance that made the little veins around my eyes pulse in time. The elevator, which should have been sleeping, woke itself with a chime, opened on an empty car and sighed closed again without taking anyone in or letting anyone out. The taller figure turned its head sharply, listening, and for the first time the fisheye lens offered me a suggestion of a face. Not features exactly, but a certain intent, like a blank page with pressure marks of the words that had been written and violently erased. The head shifted as if it had smelled me through the keyhole. I swallowed, loudly in my own ear, and retreated from the door by an inch, then another. In the corridor, the figure didn't move for a count of 5 deep seconds, and then, with anticlimactic normalcy, it disappeared back into 4C. I waited. Time slowed down around the red numerals on my stove, as if they too had become unsure of the way forward. The bleach smell thickened. The dragging sound returned once more, now from inside the apartment, where it bumped against unseen furniture and knocked once softly against the door itself from the wrong side. Like a gentle request, a whisper answered. The bundle resisted. A laugh, too quick to be joy, too dry to be relieved, decomposed into a cough. In the alley, a cat shrieked and then calmed. A siren's ghost passed without a body. I realized I was holding my own breath to avoid fogging the glass. When I finally exhaled, the peephole clouded and cleared, and with that brief blindness, I decided to commit a small act of courage or stupidity. I unlatched the chain and turned the deadbolt with all the delicacy of a thief. When I cracked the door, no more than the width of 2 fingers, the hallway's stale night air wove itself into my apartment like a curious guest. The bleach hit me fully then, not harsh anymore, but almost sweet, a clean that had stayed too long and learned bad habits. Across the corridor, 4C's door was nearly shut. Nearly, but not. Through the narrow seam, a pale strip of their entryway showed, too pale, as if every surface had been newly wiped and then wiped again, the grain raised by zeal. The seam darkened for a moment as something inside passed close to it, and the air pressure changed, a household's lungs taking a careful breath. I leaned a fraction farther into the gap, listening with the intentness of someone reading Braille in their own life, and the sound came clear. Fabric rubbing slowly on fabric, the squeak of damp against tile, the soft clatter of something hollow rolling and then being stopped by a steady hand. "Get back," a voice said inside my head, but the voice didn't belong to me. It belonged to the building, to the pipes, to the old elevator cable that dreamed of falling. It was a voice of metal fatigue and settled dust. The corridor light buzzed and dimmed and then brightened with a pulse that seemed timed to my heartbeat. From behind 4C's door, a hint of music bled out, slowed down and reversed by distance. Notes that should have been comforting, a lullaby or a hymn, made wrong by being played in the wrong direction. I balanced against the doorframe, palm flat, feeling the building's pulse in my bones, and let my eyes rest on that seam a moment longer, the place where 2 worlds failed to meet. The dragging ceased. Then, after a heartbeat so quiet it sounded like the memory of a heartbeat, I heard something unmistakable. The single sound that snaps a night into a different shape. Knuckles, deliberate and unhurried, rapped on the inside of the neighbor's door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. 1. The pattern of someone seeking permission from the room they are already in. The handle turned without opening. Another whisper, a syllable that might have been a name scratched thin to keep it from waking. I closed my door with care and put every lock back into place, Metal sliding into metal with a finality that felt less like safety and more like an agreement. Then I stood in the dark kitchen, spine against the cool of the refrigerator, and let the city's anxious silence fold over everything again like a sheet very carefully spread. The new neighbors, I thought, were doing something at 3:17 a.m. that required patience, bleach, and a choreography of knocks that belonged to a different house. The red digits of the clock clicked forward, and beyond the wall we were now sharing, something heavy settled as if pleased to be at last exactly where it had always been waiting to be. What exactly were my new neighbors moving in the middle of the night? And why did it feel less like they were bringing something into their home than inviting something already here to come out? When morning came, the world outside my window wore the kind of ordinary mask that makes you doubt the horrors of the night. Sunlight bounced off the windows of parked cars, pigeons fought over bread near the dumpster, and the mailman shuffled past with the patience of someone who has seen everything and believes in nothing. Yet, as I poured my coffee and watched the steam rise in lazy spirals, the memory of those dragging sounds clung to me like the smell of bleach that had not entirely left the hallway. The building itself was old, built in the 1960s, with hallways too narrow for comfort and walls thin enough that you learned the habits of your neighbors without ever meeting them. My apartment, 4B, was small but sufficient. A galley kitchen that smelled faintly of rust, a living room where the floor slanted ever so slightly toward the center, and a single bedroom that collected shadows in the corners no matter how many lamps I placed.
I had lived there for 2 years, long enough to know the quirks of the pipes, the cough of the elevator, and the particular creaks of each floorboard. This intimacy with the building's body had always comforted me, until last night, when the building had begun to whisper in voices not its own. I told myself that new neighbors moving in late at night wasn't unusual. People had their reasons. Maybe they worked nights. Maybe they had friends helping them who could only come after hours.
The logical part of me tried to soothe the rest, but there was a thin crack in that logic, and through it leaked the image of bare feet dragging something heavy down the hall. I tried to bury the memory under spoonfuls of sugar and sips of coffee, but the taste of unease was stronger. By noon, curiosity had begun to gnaw at me. I had not seen them in daylight yet, and daylight has a way of making monsters look like ordinary people. I decided I would do something simple: step into the hallway, check my mailbox, and perhaps steal a glance at the door of 4C. I rehearsed casual scenarios in my mind: a nod, a smile, maybe even a polite introduction if I caught them at the right moment. But when I opened my door, the corridor was empty, its carpet freshly vacuumed, its silence intact. Only one thing felt different. The doormat in front of 4C was gone, as though they had decided that even this small gesture of welcome was unnecessary. The smell of bleach had weakened but not vanished. It clung faintly to the air, mingling with the scent of old carpet and the distant aroma of someone's reheated lunch. I crouched slightly, pretending to tie my shoe, and noticed that the threshold of 4C bore faint streaks that the vacuum had missed, lines where something heavier than furniture had been dragged. The streaks led inward, vanishing into the darkness of the closed door. That night I sat by my window with the lights off, pretending to read but really listening. The building told its usual bedtime stories: muffled television sets, pipes adjusting to the cold, the occasional slam of a distant door. But my attention kept circling back to the apartment across the hall. At 2:47 a.m., the first sound came: soft footsteps, deliberate, almost measured. Then a hush, as though they were pausing to listen for me. The dragging resumed, but lighter now, as though whatever was being moved no longer resisted as it had before. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams bled into the waking dark, and in each dream I was in that corridor again, peering through the peephole, watching bundles shift and shadows bend. I woke at dawn with sweat cooling on my neck, unsure which moments had belonged to the night and which to me. Days passed, and the neighbors revealed almost nothing of themselves. I never heard laughter or arguments, never smelled food cooking, never saw lights glowing behind their curtains. Only at night did their presence announce itself in the same slow choreography: drag, pause, whisper, drag again. Each time, the pattern etched itself deeper into the marrow of the building, until it felt less like they were moving in and more like they were performing a ritual the building itself demanded. The only detail I managed to catch came one afternoon, when I was returning from work earlier than usual. As I stepped from the elevator, their door opened just slightly, and in that moment, I saw a pale hand withdraw quickly, as though ashamed of being seen. It was not just pale. It was almost colorless, veins visible beneath thin skin, fingers long and bony. The door shut with a soft click, leaving me with the certainty that whoever lived inside was watching me as closely as I watched them. By then, I had begun to notice changes within myself. My sleep grew shallow, my appetite dulled, and I found myself listening for them even during the day, waiting for the first hint that they were stirring. I told myself I was only being cautious, that any responsible neighbor would want to understand who lived so near. But deep down, I knew it was not responsibility driving me. It was something darker, a fascination that carried the weight of inevitability. The building, too, seemed complicit. Its lights flickered more often, its elevator stalled between floors, its pipes groaned with a resonance that matched the rhythm of those midnight draggings. The whole structure seemed to lean toward 4C, as though acknowledging that it was no longer the same building it had been before they arrived. I began to wonder if the building had been waiting for them, if perhaps my role here was not to live in 4B at all, but to witness whatever unfolded across the hall. And as another night fell, bringing with it the now familiar hour of whispers and movements, I could not escape the thought that they were aware of my watching, and that each sound they made was less a secret and more an invitation. The third week after their arrival was when the rhythm of the nights began to change. What had once been the predictable dragging of something heavy grew less steady, more erratic. Some nights the noises would start at 1 a.m., sometimes as late as 4, as if the hour itself didn't matter anymore. Only that darkness was absolute when they began. The building had grown attuned to them. I could feel it in the way the hallway light outside my door would flicker just before the first scrape sounded, as though the current in the wires bent itself toward 4C. It was the repetition that unnerved me most. A certain sequence of thuds and pauses repeated across several nights, like the refrain of a song, a bump against the wall, 3 seconds of silence, then the soft brush of something over carpet. Again and again. Even when I lay in bed pressing the pillow to my ears, the pattern pressed through fabric and bone, engraving itself inside me. I found myself waiting for it each night, dreading and craving its arrival, the way a child waits for a bedtime story that terrifies them but feels incomplete without it. The smell returned as well, not just bleach now, but something sour beneath it, faint but undeniable, like wet earth or metal left too long in rain. The odor would drift under my door in thin waves, so subtle that at times I thought I'd imagined it, until my stomach tightened and the back of my throat burned. More than once I opened my window in the middle of the night to let in the city's polluted air, just to wash out the taste of whatever seeped from 4C. And then came the whispers. At first I thought they were only the rustle of fabric or the squeal of pipes, but soon the cadence of language became impossible to ignore. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all, but there was intent in them. They rose and fell with rhythm, like prayer or chant, a sound that seemed less meant for ears than for the walls themselves. Sometimes the chant would cut off sharply, as though interrupted by a mistake, and a sharper voice would hiss in correction before it resumed. I began to lose track of time. Days felt like brief interruptions between nights, my work slipping through my fingers in a haze of distraction. Co-workers noticed the shadows under my eyes, the way my hands shook when I held my coffee, but I gave excuses. Insomnia, stress, nothing serious. How could I tell them that I spent my nights listening for the breaths of strangers across a hallway, convinced that the building itself was learning to speak through them? One night, unable to resist, I pressed my ear flat against the wall that divided 4B from 4C. The wallpaper was cool and slightly rough, and through it came a vibration more than a sound, a deep murmur that thrummed in my teeth. For a moment I could swear I felt the wall itself expand and contract, as though it were no longer stone and plaster but lung and flesh. I tore myself away, trembling, but even from my bed I felt the phantom pulse echoing in my ribs. Sleep abandoned me completely. Shadows thickened in the corners of my apartment, and sometimes I thought I saw them shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The reflection in my bathroom mirror seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, my own face returning to me slightly after I moved. I told myself it was exhaustion, the tricks of a mind deprived of rest. But the building had begun to feel less like shelter and more like a host, and I liked something it had permitted to stay only until the true tenants arrived. One evening, as I returned home, I found a thin envelope slipped under my door. There was no address, no stamp, no handwriting on it. Inside was a single page, blank except for a faint smear in the middle, dark brown and dry. It looked like nothing until the light caught it, and then it looked like everything. Like a fingerprint, like a map, like the imprint of lips pressed too hard. My stomach lurched as I realized I didn't know whether it had been meant as a warning or an invitation. That night the sounds were louder than ever. Not just dragging, but pounding, the slam of something against the floor. A muffled cry quickly silenced. I crept to the peephole again, heart a drum in my throat, and saw the door of 4C wide open. Inside, the apartment was completely dark, yet from that darkness spilled movement. Shapes shifting, taller than they should have been, shoulders too broad, arms too long. The bleach smell was so sharp my eyes watered. And then, for the first time, one of them stepped fully into the hallway. I couldn't make out their face, but I saw the way their head turned sharply toward me, as though the peephole itself had betrayed me. Their bare feet stopped just outside my door, no more than a yard away. They stood there in silence, breathing slowly, and I could hear it through the wood, a rhythm steady and patient like someone counting heartbeats, waiting for mine to align with theirs. I held my breath until my vision blurred, until at last they turned back toward 4C. The door closed with a whisper, the sound ceased, but from that moment on I knew they were aware of me, and awareness, I realized, was only the beginning. The night it all shifted was colder than the others, the kind of cold that creeps through plaster and makes the floor itself ache beneath your feet. I had been dozing in the armchair by the window when a sudden thud jolted me awake. It wasn't the usual dragging, this was sharper, as if something had been dropped hard enough to make the pipes rattle in their casings. I glanced at the clock, 3:03 a.m., and for the first time, I didn't hesitate. Something inside me had moved past curiosity into compulsion. I needed to know. I crept to the door and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway glowed with its usual sickly yellow, but now the door to 4C stood wide open. A strip of blackness gaped there, darker than any shadow I had ever seen. From within came the low hum of voices, but unlike before, they weren't whispers. They were chanting, a slow, deliberate rhythm that reverberated in my chest like a drumbeat muffled by flesh. On the hallway carpet lay another of those elongated bundles, this one half-wrapped, as though whoever dragged it inside had been interrupted. A pale hand protruded from the torn edge of the fabric, stiff fingers bent at odd angles, nails cracked and blackened. My stomach lurched, but before I could step back, movement caught my eye. From the depths of 4C, a figure emerged, taller than I remembered, its shoulders grazing the frame of the doorway. It was carrying something metallic, a bucket, half filled with liquid that sloshed thickly as it moved. The smell hit me then, copper, raw and unmistakable, riding on top of that persistent bleach. My hand tightened on the doorknob, though I had no intention of opening the door. My body wanted me to flee, yet my mind had anchored itself to that small circle of warped glass. The figure set the bucket down beside the bundle and crouched. I could see the tension of its spine, the strange elongation of its arms as it reached for the exposed hand. Then came the sound, a wet tearing, followed by a sharp crack. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making noise. The chanting inside grew louder, more insistent, as though feeding on the violence, and then, suddenly, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The figure straightened slowly, head cocked, and turned its face toward me. This time there was no doubt. It was looking directly into the peephole, eyes catching the dim light in a way that made them gleam like wet glass. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, my breath rasping loud in my ears. A moment later, 3 knocks landed on my door. Not frantic, not polite, just steady, deliberate. 3 knocks followed by the slow drag of a fingernail across the wood, a sound that made every muscle in my body seize. My legs wanted to run, but where would I go? Down the hall, past that open door, out into the night where the building's shadows seemed to follow. The knocking stopped, but I knew then that I was marked. They had felt me watching too many nights. I had crossed an invisible boundary, and now there would be no slipping back into anonymity. Whatever was happening inside 4C, I was part of it simply by knowing it existed. I backed away into my living room, but even there the building refused to let me hide. The radiator clanged with a rhythm that mimicked the chant I'd heard. The light bulb above me buzzed until it burst, showering the room in darkness. And beneath it all, faint but clear, came the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Only this time, it wasn't from across the hall. It was inside my apartment. The dragging came from the bedroom. At first it was faint, a suggestion more than a sound, like fabric whispering over wood. But as I stood frozen in the dark living room, it grew heavier, deliberate, as though something large had settled itself on my floorboards and now sought to pull its weight toward me. I wanted to tell myself it was imagination, the echo of what I had just witnessed across the hall. But the boards groaned, bending under a pressure I could feel reverberate through the soles of my feet. I reached blindly for the lamp, but of course it was dead. The bulb shattered only moments before. The city outside my window had dulled into silence. No sirens, no buses, no wind, as if even the world beyond my walls refused to interfere. My chest tightened as I stepped forward, each movement deliberate, my breath shallow. I whispered into the darkness, "Who's there?" But the words sounded fragile, absurd, immediately devoured by the air. From the bedroom, a low moan answered. Not human, not entirely, but thick and muffled, as though pressed through wet cloth. The dragging resumed, heavier now, closer. Something scraped along the baseboard, then stopped just shy of the threshold. The silence that followed was worse than any noise because I could feel it breathing. Slow, cavernous inhales that sucked the warmth from the air, leaving the room colder with each breath. I stumbled backward toward the door, considering escape, but a faint glow caught my eye. It leaked from beneath my own bedroom door, a thin red line stretching across the floor, like the pulse of a vein. Against it, a shadow moved, broad and misshapen, bending itself at unnatural angles to fit inside the narrow room. The chanting began again. Not from across the hall this time, but inside my apartment. The same low rhythm reverberating against my walls. My teeth vibrated with it. My chest rattled like a hollow drum. I clapped my hands to my ears, but the sound sank straight into bone, bypassing flesh. From the hallway came a reply, an answering chant, deeper, resonant, like the 2 apartments had become separate throats of the same voice. The door to my bedroom creaked open. Inch by inch, the red glow spilled wider. My breath caught when I saw it. Not a lamp, not fire, but the unmistakable shimmer of blood smeared across the floorboards in wide strokes, glowing faintly in the dark as though illuminated from within. And there, in the doorway, stood one of them. Its face was wrong, too long. The features stretched like melted wax. Its eyes were pale, nearly white, glowing faintly in the light of the blood. Its mouth did not move, but the chant continued, pouring from it in a voice that did not belong to a human throat. In its hand it dragged a shape, another bundle wrapped tight, but this time I knew it hadn't come from outside. My stomach dropped with realization. This bundle was the size of me. I staggered backward, my shoulder slamming into the wall. The creature tilted its head, studying me with a strange patience, then released the bundle. It fell heavily, landing with a wet thud that reverberated through the apartment. The wrapping split slightly and something pale and familiar spilled out, a hand, thin and bony, the same shape as my own. I screamed before I could stop myself. The sound barely left my mouth before it was drowned by the chorus rising around me. The voices from 4C joined in, the walls themselves humming, the floorboards trembling under the weight of it. My lights flickered once, then burst, showering sparks, and in that strobing darkness I saw them. Not one, not two, but many, stepping from the corners of my apartment as though they had always been there, waiting for permission to appear. The figure closest to me reached out with its elongated hand, fingers stretching impossibly far. The smell of bleach and copper enveloped me, burning my throat, making my eyes water. The hand brushed my cheek, cold and damp, and in that touch I felt not malice, but inevitability, as though I had been claimed long ago and had only now become aware of it. The chanting swelled. The red glow pulsed brighter, and the apartment seemed to breathe with them, walls flexing like ribs. My last thought before the darkness swallowed me was not of escape, but of surrender, as though the building itself had decided my fate, and I was nothing more than another offering in their midnight ritual. When I opened my eyes, the apartment was silent again. Morning light leaked pale and indifferent through the blinds, carrying with it the hum of traffic and the chirp of birds that had no idea what had taken place hours before. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, born from insomnia and paranoia. But then I saw the floor. The boards in my living room were still stained with faint streaks of red, not vivid anymore, but dulled to a brownish smear that resisted every blink of denial. The air reeked of bleach, sharp enough to sting my throat, and the faint sound of water running drifted from the pipes, as though the building itself was trying to wash away the memory of what had happened. I stumbled to my feet, dizzy, and looked toward my bedroom. The door stood ajar, the space beyond unnaturally still. The glow was gone, but in its absence a darker shadow lingered, stretching long and crooked across the floorboards, though nothing in the room should have cast it. My body screamed at me not to enter, but my legs carried me forward as though some pact I had never signed bound me to witness the aftermath. The bundle was gone. No trace remained except for the faint impression in the floorboards, a dent where weight had pressed too long. My bed was stripped bare, sheets missing, mattress damp as if something had seeped into it. The wallpaper bubbled near the corners, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what I had seen. Across the hall, the door to 4C was wide open again. Sunlight from the small window at the end of the corridor spilled across its threshold, but inside was nothing but darkness, a void that rejected light. For the first time, I realized that in all these weeks I had never once seen those neighbors in the daylight, never heard them laugh or argue, never watched them leave the building. They existed only in the hours when the city slept, and perhaps that was the only time they could exist at all. I should have run, packed a bag, fled down the stairwell, left behind the lease and the furniture and every shred of life I had built in 4B. But instead I lingered at my doorway, staring into the yawning black of 4C, feeling its gravity pull at me. Something whispered, low and intimate, not from across the hall this time, but from inside my own skull. You belong here now. That night, when the city folded itself once more into silence, I didn't resist. I turned off my lights and sat by the door, waiting. At exactly 3:11 a.m., the dragging began again, but this time it came not from outside, not from across the hall, but from within my own apartment. The board shifted under weight I could not see. The air grew thick with bleach and copper, and the rhythm of the chant rose from my walls like breath. I pressed my ear to the wood of my door and listened. From the hallway came a second chant, deeper, harmonizing with the one in my room. The two voices merged, filling the space between 4B and 4C until there was no space at all. Only one pulse, one rhythm, one home. And when I finally looked into the mirror hanging crooked above my sink, I saw not my own reflection, but a pale, elongated face staring back, smiling faintly as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. The neighbors had not come to my building. They had awakened it, and now I was part of them. Forever.